Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast for grown-ups where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories. We're your hosts, Dr. Randall
and Dr. Caitlinn, two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us. This show will cover worldwide mythology, and Season 2 will explore mythological creatures found in folktales around the globe.
So join us as we laugh, talk, and sing for The Mything Link Season 2. Monsters and cryptids and beasts!
Oh my.
I think that was perfect.
Perfect.
Great. Welcome to episode 2.
Oh my.
Oh my, indeed. So we're so excited because today we get to play an interview where I got to speak with Jane Gormley. She is the founder of Craicly Stories, a group in Ireland. And so we are really excited to be able to have her on the show. And she's gonna give us some details on Irish culture and folklore. And I don't know how to transition. And so before we play our interview with Jane, we wanted to give a little context for some of the creatures that we're going to be talking about in this episode.
So before we get started, we gotta give you a content warning. This episode will include topics such as infanticide, death of children and infants, childhood illness, starvation, and poverty. Keep that in mind as we continue forward.
So one creature is called the Púca.
Púca.
Which is so exciting because I met Jane as part of a Samhain festival. And Samhain, of course, is the Irish word for Halloween. And I was lucky enough to go out to Ireland this past year over Halloween to attend an Irish folklore festival called the Púca Festival. And it's named for this creature of Irish folklore called the Púca. So the Púca is considered a fairy and is arguably one of the best known fairies of the Irish folkloric tradition. And the Púca is a shape-shifting trickster, our favorite over here on the Mything Link.
Mm-hmm.
And the Púca will typically show up as a dog or a horse or a goat or perhaps a human with elements of one of those other animals, like goat ears or a horse tail or something like that. The Irish word for Púca comes from the word for male goat. And he's been known to mostly show up at nighttime, and he's black in color. And the Púca is typically depicted as a black creature of the night, and he usually will trick somebody into getting on his back and then take them for a wild ride around the countryside. And basically the idea is if you fight against the Púca, you're going to have a really, really rough night. But if you just allow it to take you for a ride, you might be in for the best night of your life if you just hold on and surrender your control to the whims of the Púca. And the Púca's sacred day in Ireland is November 1st, the day after Halloween. And there are some folk traditions that have ties to our modern day Halloween traditions.
Trick or treat. So, correct me if I'm wrong because I've never been to Ireland. But from my understanding, because the folklore and folktales of the Púca originate from agricultural remote towns in Ireland, after Samhain, farmers will leave some of the crops behind in the fields instead of harvesting them as a sort of offering to the Púca, a Púca share, if you will, to try and dissuade the Púca from causing further harm or mischief or trouble to them. And so, because it's after Samhain and all of these things related to Halloween, this is the origin of trick or treat, right? They're leaving out little sacrifices and treats and things for the Púca.
Yeah, it was essentially paying the Púca off to ensure that you weren't the recipient of any mischief. So the Púca is like a mischievous trickster type figure. And yeah, you wanted to make sure that he was on your side for sure. I have this great book here. It's called The Faerie Isle by Shanae Quinn, Tales and Traditions of Ireland's Forgotten Folklore. And this is a book I picked up when I was in Ireland. And we do have a autographed copy of this book that will be auctioning off to fundraise for our Irish trip that we'll be taking this summer. And if you're interested in the fundraiser or in signing up for the trip yourself, you can visit fernwaycollective.org. The link will be in our show notes. There's a story in here about the Púca, and it says that as terrifying as the Púca was, there was always something likable about him. And you knew if you kept him talking and minded your manners, he'd cause you no harm. And basically, like, if you just accept the mischievous nature of the Púca and go along for the ride with him, then you would just have fun and nothing bad would happen. But it's like the fear itself would be kind of like your downfall with this creature.
The Púca was said to often pick up people who had been hitting the bottle a little too hard. When people woke up from their experiences with the Púca, they felt drunk. And so it, like, to me, begs the question, is this a story of, oh yeah, I stumbled home drunk from the bar and ended up like some random place because I got lost in my house, like, oh, the Púca just
The
took
Púca
me
took
on
me for a ride.
for a ride, you know. I wasn't actually drunk at the tavern, Mom. I was wife.
Yeah.
I was
And
the
Púca
Púca
took me
had me
for a
all
ride and
night.
I woke up disoriented.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I don't know if that's real, but to me, that's like.
Heck yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So the most famous story of the Púca is the story of King Brian Boru. And this kind of fits into exactly what Randall's saying. So this king, he and his knights or whoever, his companions, were out doing something and they stumble across this black horse, and all of his companions encourage the king to not get on the back of the black horse, but the king is determined to get on the back of the black horse. It's the Púca, and the Púca is notorious for convincing people to get on its back and then just taking them for a motherfucking joyride. And that's exactly what the Púca does with this king. For 4 days, he just like whiplashes the king around the Irish countryside and shows him all these hidden secrets and truths about the Isles. And eventually, 4 days later, he stops and he thanks the king for the king's bravery to get on his back, and then protects King Brian Boru and his kingdom indefinitely. Is It's like the Púca is rewarding the king for his bravery to get on the Púca's back and just go along with the ride and let the Púca show the king the countryside and all of its secrets, which I think is really fun. There's another story of the Púca that I really like too. There's a farmer who decides to employ a young boy to look after his livestock. And his job, the young boy's job, is to take care of the cows to milk. But this young horse, as soon as he was finished milking, would constantly jump in the young boy's direction and try and hoist the boy onto its back. And so it doesn't say really how long, but the horse would get under the boy's legs and push the boy on its back, and then just every night take him like on this wild journey. The horse would deliver the boy back in the morning, and the guy who had hired the young boy was like, this is not working out for everybody. Like, this needs to stop. So he gives the young boy a pair of spurs to wear to stop the Púca from taking him on this wild ride. And they don't actually say spurs in the story because of the superstitions about iron in old Irish folklore. So they call it, I think, like pointy things or something like that. The farmer gives the boy pointy things to put on his shoes, and it works. He attaches these things. One night, when the horse forces him onto his back, the young boy uses the pointy things and falls off the horse. And the long story short is the horse ends up protecting the boy from this great flash of light. And it turns out that this great flash of light was a malevolent spirit trying to harm the little boy. And the boy asks to the Púca who just protected him, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm the Púca." And then they part ways and the boy never sees the Púca again. So basically the story is the Púca as a horse just taking this little lad for all night rides for an extended period of time, and then protects the little boy from a malevolent spirit, says, "I'm the Púca," and then dips. And so mischievous is like the perfect word to explain them. I mean, sometimes I guess they can be a little malevolent, but for the most part, they're just causing mischief for mischief's sake. And then in the end, it's like a positive. The mischievous spirit protects the little boy from something else. Which I don't know if that's necessarily true of all Púca stories. That's the fun part about all these stories is even though the Irish islands are super small, there's all these different versions of the same folklore because, like Randall said in our last episode, it's coming from the people up. So it's very specific to each community, even though each community has their own kind of encounter with these mystical creatures.
Right. And it's like, I'd say it's because each community has their own encounters with these creatures that, like, these stories keep going because of eyewitness accounts. And there's this idea in folklore called legend tripping, where your knowledge of the story and your expectation of having an experience like aligned with the structure of that story is enough to create that experience, right? So when you go to a place that you know is haunted, just you having the expectation that you're going to have a reaction to the haunting will give you a reaction as if there is a haunting, regardless of what else is going on, right? So when we're talking about folklore, is like if you're in the dark forest in the middle of the night and there's a rustling in the bushes or a distant howl, how can you be certain of the exact nature of the creatures hiding in the unknown darkness? Right? But like as humans, our brains want to fit any new information onto an existing framework that we already know and understand, right? We want to categorize it, we want it to make sense. And that idea of legend tripping is that because you're expecting to have an experience, anything that happens that your brain can't immediately categorize, it'll categorize into that experience for you. So even if you just hear a raccoon rustling in the bushes, you'd be like, was that the Púca? I almost saw it, right? It like gives us a structure to put these on, and it like categorizes all of those unknown quantities onto this one creature. And then especially when the creature is a shapeshifter, like you can have so much reinforcement of these folk tales. Like if a goat escapes or a horse escapes, right, and is just riding along with or without a rider, it provides a framework for that. And so these tales endure and they keep getting passed down and passed down because there are new eyewitness accounts that keep getting added to them. And every local town or village will have their own versions of what those eyewitness accounts look like. And now we have reports that it could be a horse and it could be brown or it could be black or it could be a goat or it could be a dog, right? Like just based on all of those different variables. And that feels so fun and magical to me.
It is fun. It's also fitting with the Púca being a mischievous little troublemaker.
So, in addition to the Púca, another really famous figure of Irish folk tale and legend is the changeling. So, the changeling,
Ooh.
ooh,
Sorry, that's not helpful.
super helpful. A changeling is another tricky shapeshifter, but this one is basically like an evil doppelganger of sorts. In Ireland fairy lore, fairies often have the power to glamour their appearance, to change it at will. And in this instance, typically changeling stories are associated with babies being stolen and taken back to the fairy world and changed with a grouchy old fairy. And these changelings could be just grouchy, or they could like go on to be evil, causing all sorts of issues, like demanding to be fed constantly, screaming at all hours of the night, just generally disrupting the peace of the entire family.
According to changeling mythologies, like Randall just said, fairies were left in the place of a human child or newborn who the fairies had kidnapped, and this was known as a changeling, right? And there were three motives that fairies had for abducting these children. One was to have a servant, another was to gain the affection of a human, or simply out of malice or revenge. So, according to Irish legend, children who had been replaced by the fairies, a fairy child, a changeling, they often appeared sickly or would not grow like a normal child would. So, like Randall was saying, they had certain characteristics like being constantly hungry or
Screaming all the time.
screaming all the time, or they would have intelligence beyond their years, or like
Or
unusual
maybe it's also known that fairies like music. So sometimes you'd know your baby was a changeling if you could trick it into playing music. Like you offer it a fiddle and it'll hop out of its crib and do a jig and
Right.
play the fiddle. Sure sign that your baby's a changeling. That's one of my favorite ones.
That's I was
And
gonna say
also,
big teeth, but
oh,
that's
yes,
better.
born with teeth. And
Yeah.
also, legend suggests that if you can trick a changeling into revealing their true age, then they'll run away back to the fairy realm. Or if you do something unusual and ask for their opinion on it, like they can't help but tell you you're doing it wrong. Or in all my 150 years, I've never seen anybody make eggs that way. And like that's one of the ways you could trick them into revealing their true age.
That's really fun.
And that's about where the fun stops with changeling stories.
I was just gonna say that's about all there is to that. Some of these children, or at least in these stories, the changelings would become like incapable of movement. And all this to say, I'm getting around to the fact with the not growing right and the incapable of movement and the hungry all the time and the screaming, that infanticide was not uncommon in these scenarios. A lot of the times, if the child was suspected of being a changeling, the child would be abandoned in the woods or, left for dead or something really, really gruesome. And I think that speaks to this anxiety in remote agricultural communities, that it is difficult in situations that are life or death when you're scraping by the skin of your teeth to survive and feed your family. A lot of times people reproduce in order to have more help on their farms. And if you have a child who is unable to participate in the provision for the family, that is seen as a negative toll. It is a drain on the scarce resources that you have available to you. And so, in a lot of ways, having a child of differing abilities was a threat to the sustainment of the family, which suggests that people are telling stories to assuage the guilt perhaps that they feel for abandoning a child that could not take care of itself, or psychologically processing that this child would not survive. There's a lot of psychological reasons in terms of individuals why we tell folk tales and stories to ourselves, to try and process through trauma or events that we don't want to be trauma or life or death situations. You have to do what you have to do sometimes. And I'm not advocating for killing babies, but
Sure,
you
sure,
know,
sure.
I'm thinking of like ancient Israel, which is a very similar,
Shocking.
like, I know, right? I know. But a lot of times the idea of the continuity of the family was that you had a lot of children because a lot of these children wouldn't live beyond 5 years old if they survived infancy. And so you have folk tales and mythologies that account for these experiences of making these decisions or trying to process. There's a number of different reasons why people would tell stories like this. And when you don't have therapists or whatever, it's going to come in the form of community stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And these changeling stories, they also function in a similar way to the idea of the Christian heaven, right? If you believe that your healthy, beautiful, perfect baby was swapped out with a changeling, and then that changeling dies, your perfect, beautiful, healthy baby is still in the fairy realm being taken care of by the Fae because they are so special and beautiful that they were the ones chosen for that. And there's comfort and safety and security in that, in knowing that your child still lives on and the thing that it was replaced with, right? Like the beauty of their spirit lives on even when the physical representation of them in our world is gone. And we see stories like this in other cultures. Like, look at the idea of Hansel and Gretel, right? In that story, their stepmom convince their dad, like, we don't have the resources for these two kids, they're not contributing enough and we don't have the resources to take care of them, so you need to take them out into the middle of the woods. And the nice versions say, and just leave them there, right? And then they're able to try and find their way back. But that's the whole idea of that story too, is like sometimes when resources get bad, kids get put out on their own.
This reminded me of, there's another European myth that's, Irish, Scandinavian, Norway, Swedish, of the Myling, which is basically, it's a vengeful child spirit, and it's the opposite. If you abandon a child who is not a changeling in the woods, it becomes a vengeful spirit. It's one of the most feared kind of spirits. It revolves around children who are abandoned or murdered. And so, you know, leaving them to not have a proper burial, they become these really horrifying spirits to deal with. And so, like Randall was saying, if you're abandoning a changeling and not an actual child, then you don't have to have in the back of your mind that you've murdered a child. Your child is still being, like she said, taken care of by the Fae. But without that myth, you're abandoning an infant in the woods. That comes back to haunt you as a vengeful spirit. And that's I think one of the functions here is creating that boundary and barrier for dealing with doing what you got to do.
I've never heard of this creature and I'm looking it up right now. I mean, especially like in Slavic folklore, I know there are like tales of vengeful spirits that punish in similar ways. Kids that were born out of wedlock is what I'm seeing.
Or kids
Like
who weren't
who
baptized.
were back. Well, what I'm reading here is that these spirits are often killed or neglected by their mothers, who usually did so because they were born out of wedlock, which meant that the children remained unnamed, unbaptized, and would haunt the area surrounding their burial site or the home of their killers. So essentially punishing the women who have no other resources and nowhere to go and no one will support them.
Part of the wording that I came across was parents who lacked the means to care for them. And having a child out of wedlock, like Randall said, means there was not the community resources.
Yeah, if they knew that child wouldn't be welcomed in the community, that child wouldn't survive either way. And the mothers, I'm sure, knew that if they tried to go out on their own with that child, they wouldn't survive without the resources of their community either.
Myling means murderling or small murdered child or something like that in Scandinavian. And I have to wonder if the spirit of revenge and malice was actually just mothers being consumed by guilt or frustration at lack of resources, consumed by. I will be the first to say that depression and feeling guilty are certainly vengeful spirits that I've had to deal with. And I wonder if that's another psychological function of folklore, is something external to help process through those emotions. Or
Yeah, it helps absolve blame. It helps psychologically process and it helps you move on from unimaginable events, right? That if you're unable to categorize them in a way that allows you to move forward, you're never going to be able to move forward. And like that's why these am I going to claim it? Are folktales a matter of life and death?
are you? Please do. I'm
You
waiting.
heard it here, folks. You heard it here.
Hot take. Have you seen Supernatural?
I have not all 20 seasons or whatever. I started watching it and it got to be too much. There was like a kraken in the water system or something, or a leviathan, the leviathan in the water system
I do
in
not
the
remember that.
pipes. It was too much. Like everything started getting like the battle for heaven and hell and the demons, and
Oh,
it like
that's fair. That's
it
part of my
lost like
attraction to it.
I like the folklore monster of the week format. And then they lost that format. And like I tried to hang on for a while. And like it all became about that angel that was with them who wears the trench coat.
STL. Yeah. The Wendigo episode was one of the first ones, and I remember looking at Luke and being like impressed that, you know, I felt like Supernatural actually did like a pretty decent job with handling a lot of these folklore, and honestly with dealing with Christian mythology too. But I was thinking as I was researching the Changeling, there's an episode of Supernatural about the changelings, and in this episode, the changelings are like they look like normal kids, but if you see them in the mirror, they have like sandworm mouths and like holes for eyes, and all they want to do
Right.
is
Yeah.
eat.
Okay.
And
Because it doesn't like maintain the fairy glamour. That's totally true to
right,
the folklore.
exactly.
Totally.
I can't remember because it's been a while since I've seen it, but I think that the real children are being kept somewhere else. And so Sam and Dean go to because these changeling children are like sucking the life out of the mothers because they're constantly hungry. I kind of want to rewatch this episode though. The Too Long Didn't Read is there's a Supernatural episode about changelings.
We should watch it. We should watch it.
Love me some Sam and Dean.
Okay, Sam or Dean.
Dean? Duh. Sam or Dean?
Dean in my youth, Sam now.
That's fair. I cannot help myself from a tall man in a leather jacket. There's something about that bad boy Dean Winchester.
He takes himself too seriously.
I fucking love it. He's such a dick. I have a SW and DW sticker on the dashboard of the car. They do in the Impala. Fun fact, everybody. I get really into my fandoms.
I started watching a couple of years ago and I probably made it to like season 5.
There's a lot of seasons.
There's a lot of seasons. Another show I liked that did like a folklore monster of the week or like folktale of the week was Grimm.
Oh, I
Did
have
you
not
ever watch
seen it.
Grimm?
No, but it's like on my list to watch.
It's one of those where I lost interest too, but like the first season or two are good. I feel like all of the case of the week type shows like eventually just develop their characters and then have some other storyline. And I get annoyed.
That's why I like Criminal Minds, because there's always a case of the week for 20 seasons.
Mm.
Also, I have some unresolved trauma.
You don't say. I also want to make sure we don't get away from the changelings without talking about the stories of changelings of new mothers, because that was a common piece of the folklore as well. Arguably, mostly the stories were about babies, but the young mother would become uninterested in things that she used to love. She would have a hard time sleeping. She would have a hard time eating. Maybe she would have a hard time nursing her baby or taking care of her family, which obviously means that she was replaced by a changeling in a society that didn't have the language to identify and discuss and treat postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety. There's a lot of hormonal changes that are associated with having a baby, especially perhaps a baby who dies. Perhaps the mother and the baby were switched by changelings, or perhaps the baby was first switched into a changeling and
then suck the
as
life
a
out of the mother.
result sucked the life out of the mother, or the mother was brought over to take care of fairy babies because fairies notoriously, don't you know, have a hard time reproducing and their babies often don't make it. But sometimes they would bring a young nursing mother over into the fairy realm to nurse the fairy children or the other human children that they had kidnapped. So the changeling tale starts as a scary story and then turns really tragic really quickly. And we see so clearly how important these stories are to contextualize and make sense of the senseless, right? Who would steal a newborn except for someone who thinks they're so beautiful and perfect that they want to keep them for their own, right? And a young mother who's gone too soon is still in the fairy realm nursing other babies. It gives some explanation. So now we are going to welcome our friend Jane, the founder of Craicly Stories, and you can find all of the links for information, and I'll let her explain Craicly in her own words. And Jane, welcome. We're so excited to have you here today.
How are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Really good. I love your backdrop.
They're the little Púcas. They're so cute. I swear I brought a couple fairies home with me from my trip.
Oh, well done. Well done. Did you have an absolutely brilliant trip?
I did. And the day I got home, my grandmother's clock that I grew up with in my house, and I have it now, it hasn't chimed in probably 10 years. And when I got home from Ireland, it started chiming. It started chiming on the hour and the half hour, and my clock was wrong because I didn't change it for daylight savings time, but the chimes were right. It was chiming the appropriate amount of times for the actual hour it was. It was very confusing, and it did that for a few weeks, and then it stopped.
Oh, what a cool thing to happen. That's brilliant.
And I have recently found out I have Irish ancestry as well, so maybe it's all connected.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. Have you been doing some research?
Yes, I've recently been talking a bit more to my mom about it, and she did her DNA through ancestry.com,
cool.
and it had a significant amount, like a 10% or so, I think, of
That's
Irish
high.
ancestry. And it's
Wow.
something that's not something we know about in our family lore.
Yeah.
So that was a surprise.
I'm going to have to do that. I was in my friend's house in Wales last weekend, and there was one of the little packages that somebody had ordered, and it was sitting on it was her birthday. I think somebody got it for her just for fun. And I remember it's the second time it's come up now because I was looking at it going, I keep meaning to do that. It's very curious sort of thing to find out about. So I think I will. I'll go and buy one after this and see what I can find out.
So how would you feel if it came back like 100% English?
Then I would forget that I had done it, probably. Yeah. I only know like a couple of generations back, and like everybody is Irish, so I think it would just be like, you are 100%. These two counties in Ireland is where all of your DNA comes from.
How does that feel, like having such a strong connection to your homeland?
Yeah, it's funny. And I'm working on the story project at the moment, and it's for a food festival in Waterford. And because it's a food festival, we're just capturing little stories for different people who kind of work in agriculture and are primary producers or contribute towards it. And there's a lady she's a seaweed forager, and she comments on that all the time. Like, she's incredible stories from like grandparents, great grandparents. She's literally from that town, like that, all of them. And she would meet a lot of tourists coming, and she says of all the things that she notices, none of them feel like the depth of connection that she feels. Like, she feels like she's part of the beach and part of the sea and has all of this history attached, and really personal history attached to it. And it was funny how she put it, because she said, I got to feel a lot of empathy for the people who come, because they don't have that to where they come from. Like, I'm sure all of their stories are different. But it was funny because it really had me thinking about it over the last couple of days since she said that. And it's something I kind of take for granted, actually. You have a lot of assumed generational knowledge, but when it's also familiar, sometimes you sort of overlook it in a way. But you have just so much social history from different pockets of what is quite a small country. So it's a really nice thing. Nearly every time you go somewhere, there's something you can remember or something you can tie to the place or someone, which is a really nice, it's very gentle kind of feeling. Everything feels very familiar. But it's only really recently I started thinking about that quite a lot.
I'd imagine it has to be like that story when if you walk up to a fish and you ask it how the water is, they're going to say what water, because they're constantly surrounded by it.
Yeah.
And it's not until you take the fish out of the water and they feel the absence of it that they even know it was there to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. And Ireland also it has recently, but very recently, like as in the last kind of 15, 20 years, hasn't really had much immigration. So, you don't you'd always say, where are you from? But like, usually because you'll have somebody in common if you spend a couple of moments discussing it. But you don't, there's not that many generations who would be really used to having people around them whom they don't know their family, or they don't know any kind of overlap. So that's quite a new thing. And, it's something that now future generations will have. Like, in my daughter's class, I have a daughter who's 6 as well. And there's so many different nationalities in her class, and languages and names. And so she'll have a really different experience growing up, I think. It'll change.
That's so interesting. I know I feel like a bit of magic when I go to the home that I grew up in as a child. And that was the home that my mom grew up in as a child as well. So I had a little bit of that, but we moved out of there when I was probably 10 and don't really go back to the neighborhood.
It's interesting, isn't it? Imagining your parents walking around with the same vista and smells and sort of, I often think about that. Like, it's odd when you think that they would have walked up and down these streets as children, and here you are.
So to get to the Púca, I read that some people think that the Púca was inspired by the woolly mammoth. Have you heard this idea?
No, but I suppose we would have had giant elk, the Irish elk. Have you seen one of them?
I don't believe I have. Are they frightening?
Enormous. So beautiful, but it's so hard to get your head around what size they were. So you think you're imagining it kind of correctly. And then you go to, like, it's actually called the Dead Zoo, is what everybody calls it, but it's
Ooh.
the Museum of Natural History. And so obviously everything is either stuffed or is a skeleton. And they have a giant elk in there, and it is monstrous in size, like so magnificent.
Wow.
So I would have thought that it was certainly, and I'm not an expert at all in more ancient history, but like that would be what everyone talks about here as having been the giant animal in Ireland.
Oh, looking it up, and holy cow, there's a picture of the elk next to a human, like an illustration, and it's humongous.
Yeah, you just can't imagine an animal that size, really. It's hard to put it into context. Like, if it walked into, I live in a farm, and if, like, you just imagine if it walked into a field now, it would look like a monster, like, because you never see a mammal that size.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's kind of two schools of thought when it comes to folklore and mythology and the origin of them. Like, one school is perhaps, especially when it comes to cryptids, like they're based on creatures that are now extinct and people are still telling their stories in the oral tradition, and they've kind of like those fish stories, they get bigger and
Yeah.
bigger and spookier. But
Yeah.
then another school of thought is that the folklore definitely functions as like a behavioral mechanism
Mm.
where ghosts and goblins, they'll typically live in places like rivers or deep in the forest or deep in caves or on the mountainside, places where you need to keep children away from, because these
Mm.
monsters are metaphors for there is something there that will steal your life, whether we give it a name and a figure as a monster or whether it's just the cliffside or the running water, like the life will be taken.
And also, I suppose, you might find remains of these monstrous size, like even bones of things that you can't explain because they didn't live in your time and nobody's ever seen one. But then the overlap in Ireland, I'm sure it's not only Ireland, but, social histories, life was so hard, like at different economic times. People were so poor, sanitation, health, food, everything was so poor and basic. When you think to the hardships and the heartbreak that people would have had to try and like not dwell on and just accept because they were just part of life. So there's a strong link, definitely, in Irish history to serious hardship, the blow being softened a bit by being out of your hands and something kind of mystical. And I suppose, yeah, like we said at the beginning, it sort of kept people sane if you were making very tough decisions. And I think like the Púca and changelings are, very indicative of that. The Púca,
Interesting.
interestingly, is, mischievous and fun, and you got to be careful with the sort of mood that it might be in because you could be very unlucky, but it can be very generous as well.
So the Puka's more of a trickster, and the headless horseman is more of a terrifying demon to punish you.
Yes. So yes, the horseman and the banshee and maybe the kelpie, which would be a sea monster, maybe not sea but water, sorry, would be a better description, like often in lakes and kind of boggy areas. But
Mm.
they would be quite sinister and quite frightening and strong as well. But the puka is playful and mischievous and could do quite funny things, like really bold but funny and not necessarily harmful, but would also be thought of as being quite smart. And there's lots of associations, but one really strong one to do with Samhain, Randall, when you were at the Puka Festival, is connected to sharing. And I've always quite liked this. So there would be behaviors around at that time of year, the emptying the field. So you would be bringing in, obviously, very agricultural environment. You would be bringing in what's left, and what is out there is for them. So there might be some that are substandard, or there might be some left there, but that would be for the puka, and that was them. And you wouldn't take it. And then some people would go so far as to deliberately leaving a little portion for the puka with that Halloween gifting, which will remind you of a more modern custom that we engage with and door-to-door gifting at Halloween, but that's where it would have come from.
So just to clarify, like you're saying that our custom of trick-or-treating, that it could have come from leaving offerings out for the puka, who, if it was satisfied, he would not trick you. If he was
Yeah, that would be
satisfied with
good
your
luck.
treat, it would be good
Yeah,
luck.
yeah, it would be a gift, to keep relations good and to make sure that he was satisfied and he wouldn't come looking for more and feel the need to, engage too heavily or bring any bad luck or just general kind of unwanted attention. So you would
Right.
gift, yeah, you would offer that up in advance. And it's interesting, obviously it's changed a lot, but it's interesting that it's all still around that the Samhain festival, that communicating between, fairies or the underworld and the mortal world is highly active.
So have you ever come across any pukas or any mischievous spirits around
Well,
Samhain?
it's very funny, right? So I know someone who worked in Donegal in the north of Ireland. The other thing about the puka is that's heavily associated with like agricultural areas and very rural areas. And I do remember a character from there who would loudly and willingly and very forthcomingly talk about having seen the black fox on his way home one evening.
Mhm.
And so the puka typically presents in most commonly a horse form. It's always a black animal of some sort. So like a dog or a fox or a wolf or, something like that with very distinctive kind of glowing eyes. And so, no, I have never seen a puka myself, but this gentleman who's like, I don't know, late 40s, early 50s, he will regularly tell everyone of the evening coming home and the black fox that he encountered on the way.
I love that.
No one really believes him, but but this is the thing. You have to just decide whether you do or don't.
Right. Well, that's the magic of these cryptids, right? Like,
Yeah,
it begs the question, like the philosophical idea of Russell's teapot.
what's that?
I can claim that there's a teapot floating out in space, and if you go looking for it and you tell me it doesn't exist, you can't ever say that
Mhm.
for sure, because I could just say, no, it was in a different spot than where you were looking. And
Yeah,
so
and at a different
it's
time.
right. So it's meant to illustrate that the burden of proof rests on the person who's making the claim that something does exist.
Yeah,
The burden of proof can't rest on the person who's trying to disprove it and say that nothing is there. So I love
yeah,
that idea that we still have these folk tales of, like, here in the States, we have a lot in the Pacific Northwest area of
mhm,
Bigfoot or Sasquatch.
yeah.
And that's definitely a legend that, like, continues to persist.
Púca, interestingly, A Midsummer's Night Dream, Puck.
Yes, Puck.
Puck,
Yes.
he's a shapeshifter.
He's a
So yeah,
shapeshifter,
yeah.
a little trickster.
Yeah. So like, this has the puka appears in lots of places and has kind of infiltrated. I certainly wouldn't associate A Midsummer's Night Dream with Irish folklore, but yeah, there he is.
Yeah, there's definitely an overlap. I mean, the whole
Yeah,
thing's about fairies and a puka.
yeah. Stolen.
Hey, who knows? Shakespeare could have been Irish.
Could have been. Yeah. Probably was actually. Good writers often are.
Good writers often are.
Yeah.
Okay, so could you give us an example of a changeling story?
Oh, they're awful. So they're all kind of similar in some ways. So the story would always begin with a change, hence the name Changeling. And the change was usually a very physical or kind of mental piece. So your baby would begin to look different, not like itself, or limbs were heavily indicative if there were suddenly difficulties with limbs. But there are many stories of mothers, new mothers, beautiful babies. Oh, and actually, that's an important thing to notice, Randall. A strong tradition is not to kind of covet babies too much, like looking into admiring a way of a baby that may veer into envy could spiritually attract the fairies who will come and be alerted to this beautiful baby and want it. So that was kind of a funny thing. You didn't linger over other people's babies for too long.
Over other people's babies or also over your own? Would this be some
Yeah,
sort of, like,
possibly.
indicative of child rearing techniques, and give a reason for why there might be some sort of distance kept in
Yes.
infancy?
Yes, I think your own also. Like, yeah, the overlooking the baby is a phrase that you would often hear, which is a really unusual one. You could do a whole podcast just on that, probably, what that means. Yeah.
My mind is spinning right now. It's wild.
Like, maybe we
Wow.
should bring it back, some of it. But no, there were like very common stories, and that beautiful story, of course, that Sinead told at the Púca Festival with the very happily newly married couple, perfect situation, beautiful house to live in. Husband leaves, wife puts baby to bed, but baby reappears, demanding more and more, and is clearly a changeling. And the situation escalates because changelings, their one fear is iron. And so she had to outcraft the changeling, because bear in mind, a changeling appearing does not mean that your beautiful baby has died. It just means that they've swapped. And the only way you can get rid of your changeling is to encourage it home. But if you harm the changeling, then your baby in the underworld will be harmed. And you have to manage this situation very, very delicately. And her situation did not end particularly well, in that she successfully exited the changeling, but in the process brought a curse on herself. And the use of the iron poked in the fire created a fire in her house. So this was a very typical thing. So, she didn't come out well at all. But the mysteriousness of the situation was just enhanced by the fact that her body was found in the house, but there was no sign of the baby, which was now stuck in the underworld with the fairies.
The idea is that at any time there's danger of one of your loved ones being taken by the fairies and replaced by, I guess the
Usually
Germans
an
would call it a
elderly
doppelganger.
fairy. Yeah, so well, it inhabits the body of your baby, but your baby doesn't look quite the same. And sometimes it's very subtle. It can be that they're acting a bit daft or disengaged, or it could be very physically clear that they have sort of their physical behavior is not in sync with how a baby should be behaving. And there's often examples of, these young babies suddenly speaking like old men, or requesting things that old men would request, or wanting more, 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 being very demanding. And so once those signs were clear, you knew you were in a very complicated situation in order to get your person back. And there's a couple of different explanations given as to why the fairies would want to do this. Why would they be giving away a fairy or changing it? And it's usually got to do with the fairy being very elderly and them allowing it to die in the mortal world, and the new baby providing lots of energy to their world.
So the new baby would be living in the fairy world.
Yeah.
You said the underworld. Is that considered?
Oh, sorry, I kind of interchanged. Yeah, no, sort of fairy world. Yeah.
Okay, so the fairy
Yeah.
world. And so then would the baby basically be raised by fairies and perhaps could be switched back one day when the changeling has grown into a teenager or something like that? Are there stories of anything like that?
It's like, yeah, take back the teenager.
Yeah, like
Enough.
now we've
Yeah.
changed him back.
Yeah, he's boring now. So,
I mean, that would certainly explain the hormonal
I would,
changes and behavioral changes of puberty. Like, oh,
yeah,
well, who raised you? Where did you come from?
I wouldn't blame the fairies for handing back their teenagers. So there was a couple of different things which are quite interesting. One of the requirements for the fairies to have the baby sometimes was put down to blood, and them needing to kind of strengthen their bloodlines every few generations. So they would use the strength of a human baby to do that. Sometimes actually it's kind of gentler than that the baby is just beautiful, and they're charmed by that beauty, which I think really comes back to what we were talking about a minute ago with, not overlooking the baby. And in terms of returning, that's interesting. So the stories change. Sometimes it's, the baby is now gone forever and you just don't know what's happened to it. And the other is that some adult have just reappeared and that's where they've come from. But I mean, there's a lot of commonality between some of these stories. I know there's
Absolutely.
some detail differences, but like how humans have had needed to find explanations or comfort, and that presents in lots of different ways. But I think this is really true, certainly in Irish mythology, that there's just a lot of social reasons as well why these provide a lot of comfort and explanation and just prevent you from losing your mind altogether because somehow this is better.
Yeah, it
That
gives some
this,
element of
yeah,
control or expectation or
yeah,
yeah,
it's just out of your hands, whether that's because it is out of your hands or because of economics or your mortal position, you have to make decisions. And this can sort of relieve you of some of the complications of that. Mm,
absolutely. So what kind of tragedy do you see the changeling being associated with?
I find the changeling terrifying. So, a tragedy, I think there's a couple of things that are all quite similar, but one kind of slightly, I suppose, obvious one would be again linked to poverty and health. Mortality rates for children would have been very high, particularly boys. So, boys became very precious. And it's interesting to see where that may have led in common times, but boys became very precious because in times of hardship, the female genetics were stronger to protect obviously future generations, whereas male genetics were not as strong. And so the baby boys sometimes would die, more often if the conditions weren't great. And I think that there was an element then of preciousness around your sons, which maybe infiltrated and things. But also, things that now we have better medical explanations for. But if a baby was born in a way or grew into be someone who, was a heavy burden on a family, that was already in really difficult scenarios. Sometimes, either not being able to protect that baby and it dying, or actually, and this is very tricky, but maybe choosing to allow the baby to
Mhm.
fail would be a really difficult decision. But, you have to put yourself back then and realize, imagine you had 5 other children and you could barely feed them and there was really poor future in store. So I think that some of the changeling piece helps you kind of share the guilt of that or give you an explanation of something that you couldn't explain. But a changeling wasn't always a baby. And interestingly, very often it was a recent mother, which I think may have been connected to maybe postpartum medical difficulties. But the stealing of the mother was to bring back to the fairyland to nurse fairy babies because that would be of benefit for them. So that's a really curious byline as well. There was actually as late as like the 1890s, like a real man tried for murdering his wife. He got 15 years and he murdered her because he felt she was a changeling. And it was still, not like acceptable, like he was tried and put in jail, but
Sure.
it wasn't, it didn't sound as daft as it would now. Like that would be
Sure.
totally crazy to say that, but it wasn't in common term at the time still, which is like not that long ago at all.
That's not that long ago at all. Wow.
No.
So in the US, one of our pieces of like early American literature folklore is a story of Rip Van Winkle. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah, also a terrifying
Could
character.
that be like a fairy story or a time slip or something? Because from
Yeah.
what I remember of the story, he like walks out of the village and like lays on a mountainside to take a nap, and when he wakes up he has a super long beard and he walks back into town and his whole family's gone, and he sees like his great grandkids and they're like, what, you're the Rip Van Winkle who disappeared 150 years ago?
And he's, he doesn't really know where he's been or what's happened in the interim, and all this time has passed. Oh, poor Rip Van Winkle. It's interesting how, even the purpose of like you said, when I was a child, I remember reading Rip Van Winkle, and I remember how frightening some of the fairy stories. There were so many threats. There were so many threats. They were very real, and they took physical form, and they could come, and they could get you, and they could take you. And our fairy stories when I was a child, I used to love them. You'd love to be frightened. And I remember a childhood friend like would tell us, her mother used to tell us stories of banshees and all these like brilliant folklore stories that some of them I hadn't heard before. They'd scare the wits out of you, but you loved them. And it's funny, I think you just learn so much for them as a child. Even if they are frightening you, you're learning a lot about your environment.
Absolutely. I like to think of folk tales as little inoculations or vaccines where
Mm.
they allow us to have a taste of the danger at a safe distance and build up a response and allow us to think through and kind of build up a little bit of those anxieties that keep us safe. Like, what would I do if I
Yeah.
was in the situation of the story? And then if that ever happens to you, you've already thought about it and considered it and have at least some plan of action.
Yeah, you've practiced.
You've practiced, exactly.
Children act out those games and they're playing together, getting
And
lost and hiding and
yep, and it's so much easier for kids to believe that they're following the rules based on their own decision making instead of that they're just the rules. So, like, that's the function of the boogeyman, keeping a child in bed and asleep, and they believe it's their decision. No, I don't want to get up and risk the boogeyman, instead of my mom told me I had to stay in bed and
yeah.
I have to stay in bed.
Where
But it
does he
then
come
becomes
from?
your own decision, like Red Riding,
Yeah.
like if I was Red Riding Hood and I was told to stay on the path and to listen to my parents and to only focus on my task, like those are hard things to do, especially as a kid when there's a whole field of flowers to pick off the path.
Yeah.
But then you remember the story of Little Red and you're like, ooh, I wouldn't want to
Yeah.
be in that situation, so I better listen to what my mom says.
Yeah. I better do as I'm told. And I'm
Better do
learning
as
that
I'm
all the
told.
time. There are strong similarities. It's curious, isn't it? The way, even at great distance, similar sort of explanations have been, kind of decided upon or have found their spot in our psyche, that's how we can rationalize this or how we can protect ourselves from something.
It speaks to the commonality of the human experience, I think. Like
Yeah.
some folks believe that there is like a common seed for all stories, but I think all humans have babies and have fears and anxieties about those kids and where they go and the places that take children or the sicknesses that take children, and our need to personify and understand and make sense of the senseless and try to like grasp at some control.
A funny thing as well, Randall, I've read this a couple of times. I'm not sure if it's lineage, but when we were speaking of the changelings, and obviously as a baby, you're at the most vulnerable point of your life, and your parents and other adults would be really protective of you. But certainly in Ireland, when like boy infant mortality rates would have been far higher than girl ones, this was where christening gowns came from, because people would start to disguise the babies as girls so as to try and trick the fairies. And it's like the one thing that is still an indicator now, because all babies, well, I don't know how many people always use a christening gown now, but traditionally, regardless of the gender of the baby, the gown is the same. And I've read in quite a few places that it's heavily linked to infant boy mortality, so you try and disguise them.
Oh, interesting. I've always wondered
Yeah.
that. I grew up Catholic
Yeah.
and my I
Oh
had my
yeah.
christening gown too. And
Lovely.
they
There
all
you
look the
go.
same.
Yeah.
They all look the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah, I just thought it was an old-fashioned thing, an old-fashioned outfit, but actually it was rooted in making sure that the babies were kind of nearly genderless, like they all just looked the same, so you weren't attracting any attention.
Interesting. And I wonder if that was born out of necessity as well, where you want to reuse the same clothes that you have for whatever children you have, regardless, right? Like, because buying clothes
Exactly.
based on gender is really just based on
Yeah,
like a social kind of
the last
pressure and
20 years.
preference.
Yeah.
But when my daughter was young and didn't pick out her clothes yet, I would just typically go to the charity shops and
Yeah.
buy whatever was in her size that I thought was fun. I didn't care if it had a dinosaur on it or a pickup
Yeah.
truck or whatever. And she
Yeah,
loves
right on.
dinosaurs, so heck
Yeah.
yeah.
Who doesn't? Who doesn't? Of
I want to
course.
make
Yeah.
sure we talk about
Mhm.
Craicly and describe it and what the goal is and what you're doing with
Yeah.
it.
Crackly is my storytelling project, and we focus on organizing situations, events when people will come and share stories to a group on a theme. And one of the central parts of this that's very close to my heart is opening spaces and places that you might not normally get to. So we've held them in private houses, in castles, in farm spaces, farm sheds in the summer, agricultural buildings that, are typically working spaces for farmers, but we bring people in the summer when they're cleaned out and they're empty, and we hold these 3-hour long evenings where there's drinks and food, and then there's the centerpiece is about an hour of typically about 6 people sharing a story that's under 10 minutes on a theme. And the themes could be anything like in with Púca, it was ghosts. And I thought that those stories were some of them were so brilliant and
Oh, they were
real
so
life.
great. And
Yeah.
Sinead's energy and
Yeah.
storytelling dynamics. I felt like I was in that burning building with her. It was incredible.
Yes. She's amazing. So Sinead, aka Wandering Stories, if anyone wanted to follow her on Instagram, she writes a lot of her own work, but Irish focused folklore stories.
Yes, I'll link
Yeah.
her information in our show notes for
Oh
everybody.
yeah. But then really, I suppose the centre point, like on that situation, Sinead is brilliant in bringing in combining true stories and folklore. But a typically crackly evening is what I call social stories. So it's people who are not necessarily trained in this or used to kind of performing. It's not theatrical. It's just really bringing back that community experience of bringing people together, allowing them listen to each other, enjoy each other. You're not interrupting them, you're not recording their stories, it's not a performance. And it's really deeply rooted in community, actually, Randall. There's some things that have happened to everyone in recent years that I just would like to do something locally about trying to redivert some of that energy into a better community policy rather than distancing people from each other.
I love that so much.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it would be good, since the majority of our listeners are not Irish, to explain what your name means. What is crack? What is
Oh, the
crackly?
crack. Yeah, a moment of inspiration. Like one of the best decisions I ever made because everyone likes the name. But so crackly, so the crack in Irish is basically just the nonsensical fun, but very much associated with a group of people. Like you cannot have the crack on your own. The crack happens when people come together and it's fun and there's conversations and jokes and teasing, but it's really friendly, it's really positive and so therapeutic. You haven't seen your friends in ages and then you meet up and you just have the crack. Or if it's not good, there's no crack. That's how you would use it in a sentence. How was last night? Oh, there was no crack. Like if it's just boring and dead and the energy's off. And then I also thought people don't typically say crackly, that we do, that's what it's called. But that wouldn't be like the crack would be a term. But I thought crackly just kind of works well in sentences and it sounds like the sound of a fire, which is quite intimate and very associated with storytelling, of course. So, yeah, just it was one of those light bulb moments, and I stuck with it.
Cool. This
Listen,
is
best of
so
luck later on
great.
today. Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Randall. We'll
This was
talk
so
again soon.
lovely.
Yeah, thanks so much for
Absolutely.
the invite.
Thank you
And
for
look at sure,
being
good luck
willing to
today.
spend
And
the time.
yeah,
Yes.
okay,
You
okay.
too.
Mind yourself. Take
Thank you
care.
so much. Have a great one.
Bye. You
Bye.
too. Bye.
Well, this was a really fun opportunity to dive into Irish folklore. And for anybody who is interested in learning more about Irish folklore, we will be taking a trip to Ireland at the end of July. You could find more information at fernwaycollective.org. It's linked in the show notes. And we are going to be taking a Wild Women's Week where we engage in the Indigenous Irish cultural practices. We'll do a little foraging, we'll do a little crafting, we'll do some Irish poetry and language, visit some archaeological sites, and hang out with Jane for a crackly storytelling session. So we hope you could join us. We have a couple spots still left. We're taking a small group of only 10 women and femme folk. So if you are interested in learning more about the trip, check out the link in our show notes, and we'll have information on our Instagram as well. And I'm so excited. I'm so excited. This was such a fun topic. These stories illustrate so clearly the functions of folklore. And this was like a great start, I think.
It was a great start
to season 2.
Thanks for chatting about this with me.
I love you so much.
I
Thanks
love
for
you
doing
so
this
much.
with me.
Yeah,
Okay.
excited to keep digging in.
Digging in. Life's a garden. Dig it.
Okay, sounds great.
Yay, great. I love you. Thanks.
Okay,
Bye.
love you too. Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Ulyate and Caitlinn Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlinn Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernway Collective Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwaycollective.org. Thanks for listening.